The richest 1% have amassed over 40 trillion in new wealth over the past decade, while the bottom half of the world's population has seen a negligible increase. This staggering disparity raises urgent questions about our economic systems and the future of global equality. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Diana Sarosi, the Director of Policy and Campaigns at Oxfam Canada, to discuss. Diana leads a team of campaigners and policy experts dedicated to advancing gender justice, tackling growing inequality, supporting social movements, and promoting active citizenship. Welcome back to What She Said, Diana.
Thanks so much for having me, Candace.
Well, when this report came across my desk, I was obviously intrigued. The numbers are absolutely staggering. So, can you start by giving us an overview of Oxfam's recent findings on global wealth disparity and the implications of these statistics?
Yes, absolutely. And, even though I've been working on this for so long, every time I see the numbers, I'm still shocked as well. Oxfam has been raising the alarm bells on rising inequality for 10 years now. So we put out a report every year showing how this gap is growing, exponentially every year. And I'm shocked when I see this number. So as you said, the richest 1% have amassed 42 trillion in new wealth over the past decade, whereas the entire bottom 50% of the world's population has hardly grown their wealth. And so, yeah, but basically over that time, over the 4 decades, the top 1% earners in the G20 countries, their wealth has risen by 45% over those 4 decades. And yeah, it's really staggering amounts. And that's why we've been really advocating for a wealth tax to curb some of this exponential growth in wealth at the top. Where while we see, at the bottom, people are really struggling, which is also true here in Canada, right? With the rising cost of living and so on. So yeah, it's not a way to run a society.
Those numbers are so staggering. It's hard to wrap your head around, and I think that people need to almost sit with those numbers and let it absorb in their head that, you know, billions of people have less money than 1% of
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
It's insane, the numbers. And so what are the main factors contributing to this growing wealth gap?
Yeah, it really is staggering. And in our last report, last January, we actually pointed out it's going to be a matter of a few years until we have the first trillionaire. Just imagine that, right? Like when we got to the billionaire point, we were already like, oh my God, how can someone be a billionaire? And now we have close to 3,000 billionaires in the world. And we're going to see the first trillionaire very soon. And so, what has happened at the same time as this wealth of the super rich has grown is there has been sort of a war on fair taxation, and so that they're not only do they have tremendous economic power, but they also have tremendous political power. They steer policies in their favor. And over the last few decades, they have really eroded our fair tax systems and made sure that they are almost paying no taxes at all. They have, very complex schemes of avoiding taxes, and so it's happened parallel to this rise in wealth that we've seen taxes going down. And so not only are they able to accumulate that wealth very quickly, but they don't pay their taxes.
And as you mentioned, they have huge influence in places in politics and on our everyday day-to-day life. And we really need to be questioning when we're seeing messaging from certain parties is who's bought that messaging, frankly. That would be my question. And just, quickly, have you calculated the difference between a billionaire and a trillionaire? So I know, for example, between a millionaire and a billionaire, A millionaire would be, if we were to look at it in time, would be 11 seconds. A billionaire is 31 years, which just sort of shows that huge gap between a millionaire and a billionaire. I can't imagine what a trillionaire is. It must be incalculable. I mean, at least to me, it would be.
Yeah, I don't even know how many zeros to put behind those numbers. It's just
It's
so huge.
crazy.
Yeah.
So let's go back to tax policies because we hear this a lot. Tax the rich, and so how have the current tax policies contributed to the disparity we're seeing, and what changes do you think are necessary to address this issue?
Yeah, so there has been, as I mentioned, this race to the bottom in terms of taxation. Obviously, it's very difficult for one country to raise taxes. So there has to be a bit of a global consensus around it. Just like, the race to the bottom was the same way. One country started and then others followed, and to stay competitive, right? Obviously, companies, a lot of these rich people are shareholders of massive companies, right? And so these companies are really working towards lowering the taxes to be able to put more money into the pockets of the shareholders. But for countries, it's very difficult to stay competitive when their taxes are much higher. And so, as this race to the bottom, we now really need sort of to reverse that. But what will require that is a bit of cooperation and consensus among many countries so that these rich folks don't just move their wealth to another country where they have to pay a lot less taxes, right? And so that's why we were really excited about what was happening at the G20 finance ministerial last weekend, where they agreed to cooperate, where they really recognized like this is a really big problem that is causing a lot of, very, very difficult consequences in our societies. And so let's come together and cooperatively try to come up with a deal on how we're going to tax the super rich, because one country at a time won't make a difference. And so, yeah, so that's why we were quite excited about what was happening around that. Obviously, this is just a small step for them to make this commitment to cooperate. And we need to keep pushing, but it's a step worth celebrating.
I want to talk about the G20 a little bit more in a second, but I'm just curious though. Can you talk to what are the impacts that that these low tax rates for billionaires actually have on global economies? How does it impact us every day?
Yeah. So there maybe to point out three particular ones. This kind of disparity can really lead to entrenched poverty because governments don't have the resources to provide basic services like education, healthcare. But also, in many places, workers are exploited for the sake of massive payouts to shareholders, right? So it's very difficult for people to dig themselves out of poverty because they're just like, one hospital bill away from completely indebting themselves. They can't send all of their children to school, for example, because they have to pay for it. So it really, yeah, entrenches poverty, and we've seen that over the decades as well, right? The rates of extreme poverty, especially over this last few years, where the growth has been like extreme on the inequality side. We're seeing a rise in extreme poverty again as well, which is really sad considering the progress that has been made. But the other part, it also really stifles growth because instead of reinvesting money into development and innovation, it just goes into the pockets of these shareholders and they, live these crazy lavish lives that are actually contributing immensely to climate change as well. And then, I mean, this kind of inequality, it creates social conflict, right? People are fed up of seeing people living lives that are just so indulgent and luxurious while they can't pay their rent and don't know how to put food on the table for their families, right? And so it just really creates, yeah, that kind of conflict that we're already seeing play out in many places now.
I'd like to talk about the G20 if we could go back to that a little bit. So, were there policies or initiatives agreed upon that these countries are now going to go back and implement, or was it more a little bit more lip service and pushing it down the road a bit?
Yeah, so they didn't come to agreement on policies. So the G20 presidency is held by Brazil right now, and so they've made taxing billionaires a priority as part of their G20, and so they've put forward an actual proposal around what that could look like, which was discussed. But they didn't all agree on the proposal. However, they agreed that this is a problem that we need to work together on. And so this work is going to continue. And I think there are sort of two streams of thinking around this. As I mentioned, the ideal scenario is all the countries in the world are on equal footing. So there isn't a possibility for these rich folks to come up with schemes to reduce their taxes in other jurisdictions around the world, right? And so over the last few years, there has been negotiations at the UN level, which includes all countries, towards a global tax convention. Um, so this is a new development. There have already been efforts happening at the OECD level in coming up with sort of schemes that include the OECD countries, but that doesn't include all countries, right? And so that's why there has been this push to move these negotiations to the UN level to include all of the countries on an equal footing. And so obviously some of the countries thought it should stay within the OECD. That's where we've made the progress over the last few years. That's where the negotiations have been happening. And then some of the countries that weren't part of the OECD, for example, want this to happen at the UN level. So that fight is going to continue, and there we have to continue pushing. Oxfam really wants to see it at the UN level. So that all the countries have a fair share, because there are large jurisdictions around the world that are bleeding resources every year because they're basically, exploited for their resources or their cheap labor and don't receive the taxes that they should be receiving. So just to give you an example, it is estimated that the entire continent of Africa loses between 50 to 100 billion dollars a year in taxation. So that is, international companies coming in. A lot of it is mining, oil and gas, and so on, right? Um, Taking all of the resources that are there out and then move on. But because they're not headquartered there or have these elaborate schemes, they're not paying any taxes. Now, that is way more than Africa gets in development aid, right? And that is the money that they really need to build up public infrastructure, public services, to dig their populations out of poverty. And so completely understand why these countries are no longer interested in what happens at the OECD. They want to be part of these conversations, right? And they want to be part of a system that works for them and not just the rich countries.
Let's turn the lens a little bit for a second on gender equality. How does the wealth disparity affect gender equality, and what measures can be implemented to address the intersection of these two issues?
Yeah, so that's a good question because it's not so obvious at first thought, right? And so what often happens is that, if there aren't these public services available in a country, it really increases women's burden of, for example, unpaid care, right? If people are sick, they're the ones who are caring for them. If a country doesn't have resources to build public infrastructure, to provide electricity, water, it is again women who have to walk for hours to collect firewood, to collect water, and then cook over fire, right? So also, these the in countries where education isn't provided for free, it is often girls who don't end up going to school because they either have to take care of other family members, or the family just doesn't have enough money to pay the school fee, and so on. So it really puts women back in terms of being able to acquire the opportunities and financial security that they need to grow their economic security really. And so it is that is really setting women back really from a very early start, and then they end up, being situated in jobs that are undervalued. They're making poverty wages, right? It really is sort of a lifelong cycle that they're trapped in when these kind of important public services that we all rely on here are not available to them.
And you referenced it a little bit earlier, but how does climate change intersect with wealth inequality, and why is it crucial to address both of these issues simultaneously?
Yeah, so there are several impacts there. So, a lot of the wealth that is being built is actually built on very polluting industries, right? Like mining, oil, gas, and so on. Like really, the fossil fuel sector is at at the top there, and obviously that is those are the sectors that have really contributed the most to climate change and still continue to do so. Another area is, and we will actually put out a report later on that later in the year, is around just the massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the very rich are using every day just for their very lavish lifestyles, right? Like private jetting everywhere. There's super yachts and so on. They really, are a disproportionate contributor to climate change by emitting just so much carbon. So yeah, on the one hand, they're really invested in industries that are destroying our planet, and then they're living these lavish lifestyles that are just crazy in terms of polluting the planet as well.
Well, Diana, I love the traction that this report is getting. I'm seeing people talking about it everywhere. So hopefully it encourages action, not just from politicians, but from people listening to put the pressure on politicians to act. Of course, Oxfam's doing great things. So, how can people keep up with what you're doing and in the actions that you're taking to change this?
Yeah, the best way to do that would be to visit our website, oxfam.ca, and sign up for our newsletter so they can find out about the different things that we're working on, but also opportunities to engage in actions. And then follow us on social media is really the best way to keep track of what we're doing. And we always have different calls to action out there to support the advocacy that we're doing at a governmental level. So yeah, there's lots of ways to follow us.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today, Diana.
Thank you so much.